Imagine being the most powerful man on the planet, the President of the United States, and then throwing it all away over a botched burglary at a hotel. Not a war. Not an assassination. A burglary. That is exactly what happened to Richard Nixon. And the story behind it is so twisted, so layered with lies, betrayal, and raw political desperation that it reads more like a crime thriller than a history lesson. Welcome to History, Veiled. Today we are pulling back the curtain on the scandal that didn't just end a presidency. It shattered America's trust in its own government forever. It's June 17, 1972. The country is in the thick of a presidential election year. Nixon is running for re-election, and by most accounts, he is virtually unbeatable. His approval ratings are solid, the economy is functioning, and his foreign policy moves, particularly his historic opening of diplomatic relations with China, have made him look like a statesman of the highest order. There is almost no political reason for what is about to happen. And yet, in the early hours of that June morning, 5 men are caught breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee inside the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. At first glance, it looks like a random break-in, a minor crime. Police are called, the men are arrested, and most of America wakes up the next morning barely registering the story. But here is what makes Watergate so explosive. Those 5 men were not ordinary burglars. They were operatives connected directly to Nixon's re-election campaign. The Committee to Re-elect the President, which, in one of history's most ironic acronyms, was known simply as CREP. Their mission that night was to photograph documents and plant listening devices inside the DNC offices. They had actually broken in once before, weeks earlier, and were returning to fix a wiretap that hadn't been working properly. Now, did Nixon personally order that specific break-in? That remains debated by historians to this day. But what is not debated is what happened next, because the cover-up is what truly destroyed his presidency. Nixon knew about the connection between the burglars and his campaign almost immediately. And instead of coming clean, instead of letting the justice system run its course, he made a catastrophic decision. He decided to bury it. Within days of the arrests, Nixon and his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, were on the phone, strategizing about how to use the CIA to pressure the FBI into backing off its investigation. This conversation was recorded. Nixon didn't know it at the time, but it would eventually become the single most damning piece of evidence ever collected against a sitting American president. That recording became known as the smoking gun tape, and when it was finally released to the public in August 1974, it confirmed what many had suspected, that Nixon had personally participated in obstructing justice from the very beginning. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, because the 2 years between the break-in and Nixon's resignation were filled with some of the most dramatic moments in American political history. Reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein at the Washington Post began connecting the dots in ways that law enforcement agencies seemed unwilling or unable to do. Their source, a mysterious figure they called Deep Throat later, revealed to be FBI Associate Director Mark Felt, fed them crucial information that kept the story alive when the White House was doing everything in its power to kill it. Nixon won re-election in November 1972 in a historic landslide, carrying 49 of 50 states. For a brief moment, it looked like the Watergate story might just fade away. But the 5 burglars went on trial in early 1973, and one of them, James McCord, made a move that cracked the whole dam open. Facing a lengthy prison sentence, McCord wrote a letter to Judge John Sirica, revealing that the defendants had been pressured to stay silent, that perjury had been committed during the trial, and that high-ranking officials in the Nixon administration were involved. The Senate launched a special investigating committee, and the televised hearings that followed in the summer of 1973 captivated the entire nation. Millions of Americans sat in front of their television sets, watching aide after aide testify about dirty tricks, hush money, and enemies lists. Nixon's White House counsel, John Dean, delivered particularly devastating testimony, directly accusing the president of being involved in the cover-up. But even then, it was one bombshell revelation that made everything else irrelevant. Alexander Butterfield, a relatively obscure White House aide, casually revealed to investigators that Nixon had installed a secret taping system in the Oval Office that had been recording virtually every conversation. The existence of those tapes meant that the truth about what Nixon knew, and when he knew it, was sitting in a vault somewhere. The fight to obtain those tapes became a constitutional crisis of its own. Nixon fired the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, in what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, an act so politically self-destructive that it accelerated calls for impeachment rather than stopping them. The Supreme Court unanimously ruled that Nixon had to hand over the tapes. He had no choice, and when the transcripts were released, they revealed a president who was paranoid, foul-mouthed, and deeply engaged in criminal scheming. The 18.5-minute gap, an erasure on one of the most critical tapes, which Nixon's secretary Rosemary Woods claimed she had accidentally caused, became a symbol of the administration's guilt in the eyes of the public. By the summer of 1974, the House Judiciary Committee had voted to recommend articles of impeachment against Nixon on charges of obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. Republican support, which had shielded him for months, began to collapse. When a delegation of senior Republican senators and congressmen visited the White House and told Nixon directly that he did not have the votes to survive an impeachment trial in the Senate, the end came quickly. On the evening of August 8th, 1974, Richard Nixon appeared on national television and announced his resignation, the only time in American history a president has ever resigned from office. He did not admit guilt. He spoke of a loss of political support as his reason, careful to frame his departure in terms of political reality rather than criminal accountability. The next morning, in an emotional and rambling farewell to his White House staff, he spoke of his mother, of not hating his enemies, and broke down near tears in front of the cameras. Then he boarded Marine One helicopter, turned at the top of the stairs, and gave his famous double V for victory salute, a gesture that felt almost surreal given the circumstances. Gerald Ford, who had been appointed vice president after Spiro Agnew resigned in a separate corruption scandal, was sworn in as president and almost immediately granted Nixon a full and unconditional pardon for any crimes he may have committed while in office. That pardon haunted Ford's presidency and likely cost him the 1976 election. Many Americans believed justice had been denied. Dozens of Nixon's aides and officials were not so lucky they went to prison, including his attorney general, his chief of staff, and his chief domestic advisor. The legacy of Watergate is enormous. It fundamentally changed the relationship between the American public and its government. The word "gate" became a suffix permanently attached to every political scandal that followed. Campaign finance laws were overhauled. The Independent Counsel Statute was born. Journalism was elevated in the cultural imagination as a vital check on power, and a deep, lasting cynicism about politicians and institutions took root in a generation of Americans that has never fully gone away. What Watergate ultimately teaches us is that the instinct to cover up, to To protect power at the expense of truth will almost always make things catastrophically worse. Nixon did not need to spy on the Democrats. He was going to win by a landslide anyway. The crime was unnecessary. The cover-up was a choice. And that choice cost him everything. That is the story of Watergate, a scandal born of paranoia, fueled by arrogance, and ended by a system of checks and balances that, however imperfectly, refused to break. If you found this video fascinating, hit that like button and subscribe to History Veil so you never miss a deep dive into the moments that truly changed the world. Drop a comment below. Do you think Nixon got what he deserved? Or should the pardon have stood as the final word? We read every single one. Until next time, keep questioning, keep digging, and keep watching History Veil.